I don't know how long I've been here. Time slides around in this place, slipping through the cracks like the faint smell of antiseptic in the walls. They keep the lights on just bright enough that I can't ever be sure if it's day or night. And sleep is a luxury they talk about in brochures and pamphlets. Sleep hygiene, they call it. Helping troubled minds find peace. But here, peace feels like an illusion, always just beyond my reach. It started with the nightmares, or at least that's what they say. A steady descent of twisted images that clawed their way out of my subconscious, leaving deep ruts in my mind. I don't remember them clearly, just flashes. A face I didn't recognize, hovering in the dark, whispering things that twisted my stomach into knots. The next thing I knew, I was here for observation. They said, to keep me safe, but it doesn't feel safe. Not anymore. Last night, as I lay staring at the cracks in the ceiling, something caught my eye, a faint mark just above my bed. I almost ignored it. This place is full of scratches, dents, and scars. But this one was different. It wasn't a scratch or a crack. It was writing. Just 2 words, etched deep and dark into the wall, as if someone had carved them in with a nail or a pen pressed so hard it left an impression. Be careful. I felt a chill then, something raw, something primal. I reached out, touching the words with my fingers, the faint ridges of each letter cold and sharp under my skin. Be careful of what? I wondered. And why was it written here, hidden just above my bed where only I could see it? As the night wore on, sleep never came. I lay there, staring at those words, feeling a rising sense of dread. And just when I thought the stillness would suffocate me, I spotted another inscription, hidden in the shadows near the window. This one was longer, more frantic, carved over and over again. They'll use your fears against you. The words were like a knife twisting in my chest. I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt those words searing themselves into my mind. They'll use your fears against you. The letters, jagged and wild, seemed to pulse with a life of their own, etched so deeply into the wall that I could almost hear the frantic scratching in the silence. Morning, at least I think it was morning, finally arrived, and I asked the nurse about the inscriptions. She stared at me blankly, her face carefully arranged in that detached expression they wear around here. There's nothing on your walls, Max. Maybe it was part of your dream, but it wasn't a dream. I know the difference between a nightmare and reality. Though lately, that line's been blurring. That night, I kept my eyes open, waiting for the darkness to settle, waiting for that unbearable silence to fall. And just like before, the whispers of the walls returned, not in sound, but in sight. More words had appeared, faint and desperate, as if they'd been waiting to reveal themselves to me. They take pieces of us, our thoughts, our memories. Each letter was uneven, written in thick, angry strokes. I traced the lines with my finger, feeling each groove, each trembling stroke. The message didn't feel like ramblings. It felt intentional, like a warning left for whoever might come after. But who and why? I started to feel sick, my skin prickling with a cold sweat. What did they mean by pieces? I wanted to turn away, but my eyes kept being drawn back, as if compelled by some invisible force. My head swam as more words seemed to bleed out from the shadows of the wall, slowly taking shape, like fragments struggling to surface. Find the cameras. The sentence sat stark and bold, glaring back at me. Cameras. I scanned the room, my heart pounding as I squinted into every corner, every vent, every possible hiding place. I lay there, barely breathing, eyes darting from corner to corner, searching. My mind was racing, every shadow suddenly suspicious, every odd shape in the ceiling tiles a potential eye watching me. Find the cameras. The words echoed in my head, pulsing like a heartbeat, amplifying my paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I felt eyes on me, even though the room was still and silent. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, my bare feet cold against the tile floor. I moved cautiously, checking each corner of the room, probing the tiny vents, feeling along the cracks in the wall. even looking behind the mirror, but I found nothing. Just the stale, empty walls, indifferent and unfeeling. But the words on them said otherwise. When I finally looked back to the wall, a new sentence had appeared, like fresh ink rising through old paper. "They're always watching, in your room, in your dreams." I stumbled back, feeling dizzy, the words spinning in front of me. In my dreams, that's what had landed me here in the first place. Nightmares that clawed at the edges of my sanity. I was here because my mind was betraying me, but what if they were doing something to make it worse? The thought burrowed into my brain, and I couldn't shake it. The doctors always ask me about my dreams, probing with questions that dig deeper each time. "What do you see? How does it make you feel?" They insist it's to help me, to understand the root cause. But now I wondered if there was something more sinister at play. As I stared at the words, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering faintly. And just when I thought the wall had given me everything it had to say, more words began to scrawl beneath the others, delicate and thin, almost shy. "Don't trust what they give you. It's in the pills. The pills. The medication they insist will keep my nightmares at bay, dull the images in my mind, smooth out the sharp edges of my fear." But what if the pills were doing something else? I couldn't bring myself to take the pills that night. When the nurse brought them, her face was the same neutral mask, her eyes glazed over with professional detachment. She handed me the small paper cup with 2 pills, a pale yellow one, round and unassuming, and a larger, white one shaped like an oval. I'd taken them without question every night before, believing they were my only hope of keeping the nightmares at bay. But now I hesitated. "Is something wrong, Max?" she asked, her tone flat but with a slight edge that put me on alert. "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I brought the cup to my lips, pretending to swallow as I tipped the pills into my mouth. But when she turned to leave, I quickly slipped them under my tongue. I gave her a small nod, and she left, locking the door with that same mechanical click. I spat the pills into my hand as soon as she was gone, watching them rest coldly in my palm. "It's in the pills." The words from the wall floated back to me, heavy and unshakable. But what exactly was it? What were they trying to do to me? I felt that same sense of dread crawl down my spine, prickling at the back of my neck. My hand clenched, crushing the pills into powder, and I swept them under the bed. I lay back down, waiting for the familiar numbness to creep over me. But this time, clarity stayed, and with it, the anxiety of knowing what I'd just done. And then, as the room seemed to settle back into its usual stillness, I noticed something. The air felt different, heavier, as though a presence had filled the room. I turned my head toward the wall. More words had emerged, barely visible, thin lines carved into the wall, like whispers etched in stone. "They don't want you to remember. It's how they control you." My mouth went dry. A cold sweat gathered on my skin, my hands clenching the sheets as if they might anchor me to reality. All these thoughts, these fears that had plagued me, the pills had kept them muffled, buried beneath layers of numbness. But now, I felt awake, truly awake, for the first time since I'd arrived. The words continued to form, filling the space near the bed. "Don't sleep. That's when they come." I spent the night in a haze, too terrified to close my eyes. Every flicker of shadow in the room, every creak of the old building settling, felt amplified, like I was tuning in to some dark frequency I hadn't known existed. The words on the wall hung over me, taunting and cryptic, leaving me raw and unsteady. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I found myself jolted awake by the sound of soft scratching. It was a faint, delicate noise, as though someone was dragging a fingertip across the wall right next to me. My heart pounded, and I lay frozen, my ears straining to locate the source of the sound. Slowly, I turned my head toward the wall. The message was still there, but more words had appeared, inscribed with the same frenzied strokes, as if etched by a trembling hand. "They watch us sleep. They write it all down." I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, almost choking. The walls seemed to close in, trapping me, pressing my fears back down into my chest. Write it all down? The thought settled like a stone in my stomach. Are they recording our dreams? All those nights, the questions they asked me about my nightmares, their relentless insistence on knowing every detail. I'd assumed it was just therapy, another attempt to help. But now, the idea of it felt wrong, twisted, like I was handing them pieces of myself with every answer, every memory I described. They'd taken my deepest fears, my darkest secrets, and recorded them like they were data in an experiment. My gaze moved back to the wall, and new words were forming, crawling across the cracked surface as though guided by some unseen hand. They feed off it. Our fears make them stronger. My stomach twisted. Stronger? A sick realization began to creep over me, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise. What kind of place was this, where they fed off the fears of broken minds, where they collected nightmares like specimens in a lab? I felt dizzy, barely able to keep my balance as my hands gripped the edge of the bed. They weren't just helping, they were harvesting. The dreams they kept urging me to share, the pills that dulled my senses, the restless nights where I'd wake up disoriented, with memories of whispers and shadows that I could never quite remember. What if all of it was a way to keep me vulnerable, afraid? And there, just beneath the latest message, scratched out in a desperate, scrawling hand, was a final urgent plea. Do not trust the doctors. Do not trust anyone. The meaning behind those words drilled into me, chilling me to my core. Because here, alone in the cold, sterile glow of my hospital room, I had no one to trust, not even myself. The morning came, though in this place, daylight barely seemed to reach beyond the thick, barred windows, casting only a pale, muted glow. My head throbbed, and I felt as though I hadn't slept in days, nerves shredded and raw. The messages on the wall were still there, dark and glaring, but it seemed no one else noticed them. When the nurse entered, she went about her routine as if my room were nothing but blank, sterile walls. She handed me the pills again, the same yellow and white ones, and waited for me to swallow them. I could feel her gaze fixed on me, sharper than before, as if assessing, testing. I faked the swallow again, the bitter taste dissolving briefly on my tongue before I spat them out under my blanket. Her eyes lingered, as though she sensed something was off, but she said nothing. When she finally left, I crouched beside my bed and wiped my hand along the floor where I'd scattered the powder from last night's pills. It clung to my fingertips, chalky and strange, and the question loomed in my mind. What is it they're giving me? I'd seen other patients here, listless, blank-eyed people with sagging faces, wandering the halls like ghosts. Was it the pills that did that? Turned them into hollow shells, drained of thought and feeling? I had to find a way to avoid them, to stay awake, to keep my mind sharp. As the hours dragged on, my thoughts kept circling back to the messages. They'd warned me not to sleep, and yet exhaustion weighed on me like a lead blanket, pulling at me, whispering for me to rest, to surrender. But something deeper, a raw instinct, told me I couldn't afford to close my eyes. And then, as the day slipped into evening, another message began to emerge on the wall. I watched in horror as the words seemed to etch themselves right before my eyes, each letter clawing into the wall with jagged precision. They take us when we sleep. My pulse quickened. Take us where? I searched my mind, tried to remember every time I'd fallen asleep here, trying to grasp at the fragments of dreams that felt like they'd been torn from me. The blank spots in my memory, the strange fog that seemed to hang over every night in this place. And then, almost as if answering my silent question, another line etched itself below the first. They bring us to the basement. The basement. My skin crawled at the word. I'd heard rumors from the other patients, disjointed whispers about a hidden floor, an off-limits area where patients disappeared for hours, sometimes days, only to return with empty stares, muttering to themselves or worse, silent, drained, like their souls had been sucked dry. I pressed my hand to the wall, feeling the roughness of the letters beneath my fingertips, and whispered, almost to myself, "Why the basement?" In the silence, a new line appeared, more faintly than the others, but unmistakably clear. Because that's where they keep the machines. Machines. I didn't dare imagine what they might look like, or what they might be doing. But the question buzzed in my mind, relentless and terrifying. What were they using these machines for? And what had they done to me? The room felt colder now, a chill that crept up from the floor and seemed to seep into my bones. The word machines echoed in my head, dark and ominous, conjuring images of metal claws and flashing lights, mechanisms built for something I could barely comprehend but instinctively feared. I sank down on the edge of the bed, staring at the latest words scrawled across the wall. The basement. I'd never seen it, and as far as I knew, none of us were allowed down there. Yet the idea had been planted, gnawing away at me, filling me with a horrified curiosity. If this place was truly as sinister as the messages suggested, then the basement, the place where the machines were, was the heart of it all. A loud, metallic clang sounded from somewhere down the hall, jolting me from my thoughts. I froze, listening. The hallway lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched and twisted with each pulse. There were footsteps, faint but deliberate, coming closer. Instinctively, I lay down and feigned sleep, hoping whoever was outside would pass by. The door creaked open, and I heard the soft shuffling of shoes on tile. Someone stood over me, and the smell of stale antiseptic filled the air. I kept my breathing slow and steady, barely daring to crack my eyes open. Through the smallest slit, I could see a figure, one of the doctors, his face obscured by the shadows. He lingered there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to stay still, even as a strange sensation, like the prickling of needles, washed over my body. And then, just as I thought I couldn't endure it any longer, he whispered, almost to himself, "Tonight, it's time for another session." I felt my heart lurch, a surge of terror filling me as he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Another session. The words looped in my mind, heavy with dread. What did he mean? And had I already had sessions without remembering them? I sat up slowly, my mind racing. The warnings on the wall, the strange gaps in my memory, the endless questions about my nightmares. It was all connected. They're taking us. They're doing something to us when we sleep. And I was next. I leaned back against the cold wall, feeling a surge of determination, my fear twisting into a desperate need for answers. I knew I had to see it for myself. If they were bringing me to the basement tonight, I'd have to stay awake, find a way to slip away and see what was down there before they put me under. The wall had more words waiting for me, faint and insistent, urging me to act. Pretend. Escape while you can. Remember the stairs at the end of the hall. I didn't know who had left these messages or how long ago they'd been written, but the urgency, the desperation in the scrawled letters, was unmistakable. Whoever they were, they hadn't escaped. But maybe if I followed their instructions, I could. The hours crawled by, and I forced myself to stay awake, each second stretching into an agonizing eternity as I waited. I felt the weight of exhaustion pressing on me, a heavy fog pulling at my mind, but I clung to the words on the wall, reading them over and over to keep myself alert. Pretend. Escape while you can. Remember the stairs at the end of the hall. Just as the clock on the wall ticked past midnight, the faint sounds of footsteps echoed down the corridor again. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay down, feigning sleep, my breathing slow and shallow. The door opened quietly, and I felt the same oppressive presence from before. This time, two shadows loomed over me. I could make out the doctor's familiar form, along with another figure taller and broader. "Is he ready?" The larger figure's voice was low and gruff, carrying a cold authority that made my skin crawl. "Yes," the doctor replied in a hushed tone. "But he's resistant. Last time he fought back." There was a long pause, and I fought the urge to tense. Fought back? I didn't remember fighting anything or anyone. What had they done to me? "Well," the other voice replied, a cruel edge slipping into his tone. "He'll be less resistant tonight. Take him to the basement. The machines need recalibrating." My stomach twisted as the truth settled over me, cold and undeniable. The machines were calibrated to our minds, to our fears. They weren't just recording our nightmares. They were amplifying them, feeding them back to us in endless loops until we could barely tell reality from horror. I felt their hands grasping my arms, pulling me out of the bed, and I kept my body limp, pretending to be under the influence of the pills I hadn't actually swallowed. They half-dragged me down the corridor, and as I forced myself to stay calm, I caught a glimpse of my escape route. The narrow staircase at the end of the hall, just like the message had described. They continued past it, oblivious to my feigned compliance. I waited until we reached the last corner before the basement door, the cold metal gleaming faintly under the dim light. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and then, with every ounce of strength I had, I wrenched my arms free from their grip and ran. I heard shouts, angry and startled, as I bolted down the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the tile. The staircase loomed ahead, narrow and shadowed, and without hesitation, I threw myself down it, leaping over the steps 2 at a time. I didn't look back, too terrified of what I might see. My only thought was escape. I reached the bottom, heart hammering, and looked around. The hallway here was lined with doors, most of them locked, their small glass windows blackened from within. But one door stood ajar, casting a faint blue glow into the corridor. I slipped inside, closing it softly behind me, and found myself in a dimly lit observation room. A wall of monitors flickered before me, each screen filled with shifting, shadowy images. Faces of patients, asleep in their rooms, each one twitching and trembling, trapped in nightmares I could only imagine. And then, my own face appeared on one of the screens, eyes wide and panicked, captured in some past nightmare as I stared up at something unseen, something monstrous. I swallowed hard, a sickening realization taking root. They were watching us, yes, but they were also controlling us, twisting our nightmares to fuel whatever sick experiment they were running. My hands clenched as I scanned the room, looking for anything I could use, any clue to what they were doing. Then I saw it. A stack of files labeled with patient numbers and a sign-in log for night sessions. My file lay on top, marked in thick red letters, fear sensitivity, high. I didn't have time to process the implications, but one thing was clear. I had to destroy whatever was down here before they could use it against me or anyone else again. My hands shook as I sifted through the stack of files, each one bearing a patient's ID number, each thick with pages of observations, notes scrawled in precise, clinical handwriting. Flipping through my own file, I caught glimpses of familiar phrases. Subject prone to lucid nightmares. High susceptibility to suggestion. But it was one line, written boldly across the first page, that held me captive. Primary candidate for fear extraction calibration. The words made my skin crawl. Fear extraction. The nightmares, the questions, the pills. All of it had been orchestrated to test how far they could push me, how deep they could dig into my subconscious and extract every last shred of terror for their machines. But to what end? And how many others had they broken before me? Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, jolting me back to the present. They were coming, and I didn't have long. I scanned the room again, my eyes landing on the wall of monitors, each showing a patient in some tortured state of sleep, faces twisted in agony as they relived their own worst fears. The machinery that fueled it all, the monstrous system I'd seen in my nightmares, was right here, humming softly, alive with the flicker of hundreds of screens. In the corner, I noticed a small cabinet labeled calibration controls. I dashed over, my hands fumbling as I threw open the doors. Inside, a complex array of switches, dials, and buttons awaited me. The labels were dense with scientific jargon, but one switch stood out, bold and bright. Emergency override. Without hesitation, I flipped it. The room plunged into darkness. The monitors flickered, their images warping, distorting as a high-pitched alarm began to blare through the facility. The patients' faces disappeared, replaced by glitching lines and static as the nightmare feeds sputtered and died. A surge of relief rushed through me, but it was fleeting. The footsteps outside were closer, louder, and I had to move. I slipped back into the hallway, staying low as I crept past doorways and down the narrow corridor. But as I reached the end, a voice stopped me cold, echoing from somewhere near the staircase. "So, you thought you'd just run, did you?" I didn't need to see his face to know who it was. The doctor with the cold, clinical voice, the one who'd been hovering over me, planning my session for tonight. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced it down, scanning the hallway for any escape route. My eyes landed on a narrow maintenance door halfway down the hall. The words "authorized personnel" only scrawled in fading letters across its surface. I darted toward it, praying it wasn't locked, and twisted the handle. It gave way, and I slipped inside, pressing my back against the door as I closed it softly behind me. Inside, darkness enveloped me, the faint hum of pipes and distant machinery vibrating through the walls. The room was cramped, lined with rows of metal shelving cluttered with supplies, tools, cleaning chemicals, and old, rusted equipment. A dim light bulb flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow that made everything look warped and ghostly. I sank to the floor, my breath shallow as I listened. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and a tense silence followed, heavy with anticipation. Then came a soft, chilling whisper, so close I could almost feel his breath through the door. "We'll find you, Max. We always do." The footsteps receded, fading down the hallway, but his words lingered, wrapping around me like a vice. "We always do." As I sat there, trembling, the walls around me seemed to pulse with secrets, their cold metal surfaces alive with stories of those who had come before me, those who hadn't escaped. I had shut down the machines for now, but the doctor's words made it clear that this place wouldn't stop until it had dragged me, and my fears, back into the basement. I knew then that destroying the machines was only the beginning. I had to get out of this place, and I had to take down whatever twisted nightmare they'd built here before it swallowed me whole. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours, crouched in the dark of that cramped maintenance room. My mind spun, the doctor's words repeating in my head like a curse. "We'll find you, Max. We always do." The machines might be down for now, but I knew it wouldn't be long before they were back online, hungry and ready to delve into whatever scraps of fear I had left to give. When the footsteps finally faded completely, I took a shaky breath and forced myself to think. I couldn't just hide. I needed to escape, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that basement. I scanned the shelves, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, looking for anything that could help. On the top shelf, buried under a pile of rags and broken equipment, I spotted a battered flashlight. I clicked it on, and a thin beam of light cut through the darkness. It was weak, flickering with every movement, but it would do. Further back, I found a heavy wrench, thick and solid, its surface rusted but still sturdy. I grabbed it, feeling a slight rush of confidence as I hefted its weight in my hand. I wasn't defenseless now. Pushing open the maintenance room door, I slipped back into the hallway, crouching low as I moved silently, keeping the flickering light trained ahead of me. The hallways felt different now, darker, more claustrophobic. I could feel the hospital's stale air pressing down on me, as though the walls themselves knew I was trying to escape and were closing in, eager to trap me. As I reached the end of the corridor, a faint, rhythmic sound echoed through the silence. It was subtle at first, but as I crept closer, it grew louder, a metallic clanging, coming from deeper within the hospital. I gripped the wrench tighter, my heart pounding as I followed the sound, rounding a corner and freezing in place. There, standing at the end of the hall, was a patient, or at least that's what they used to be. He stood rigid, his head tilted to one side, his face blank and hollow. His hospital gown hung loosely from his bony shoulders, and his eyes, dark, sunken hollows, stared straight ahead, unseeing. But it wasn't just his emptiness that made my skin crawl. It was the faint, red light glowing from the small implant at his temple, pulsing in rhythm with the clanging sound, as though he were some kind of automaton. He turned his head slowly, and even from this distance, I could see the blank, eerie precision of his movements, like he was being controlled by a set of invisible strings. The red light blinked faster, and then, without warning, he began to shuffle toward me, his footsteps mechanical, relentless. I backed away, panic gripping me as I realized what he was. One of the patients they'd taken, one of the others they'd experimented on, stripped of fear, of thought, turned into something else, something hollow. I remembered the words on my wall. They take pieces of us, our thoughts, our memories, and here was the result. An empty shell, wandering the halls under their control, a puppet in their twisted experiment. I turned and ran, wrench in hand, heart pounding as the hollow patient's footsteps echoed behind me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get out before I ended up like him. Stripped of thought, of fear, reduced to a mindless husk. At the end of the hall, I spotted a stairwell. I sprinted toward it, wrench clutched tightly, my breath ragged as I burst through the door and took the stairs 2 at a time, heading up, away from the basement, away from the hollow shell pursuing me. As I climbed, another message began to form in my mind, unbidden, as if someone had whispered it from the walls. They turn us into monsters to keep their nightmares alive. The words settled like a cold weight in my chest, and I climbed faster, desperate to escape this place before I lost myself to it completely. I kept climbing, each step feeling heavier, as if the stairwell itself were conspiring to hold me back. The faint metallic clanging below grew softer, but I could still hear it, a reminder that the hollow patient was somewhere behind me, his lifeless shuffle pressing relentlessly forward. I didn't dare look back. Reaching the top floor, I shoved through a door into a long corridor bathed in an unsettling, sickly yellow light. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with more locked doors, each marked only by a number. The stench of stale antiseptic was overwhelming here, sharp enough to burn my nose. I moved forward, the silence thick and almost buzzing, pressing down on me like a weight. As I crept forward, something caught my eye. A door at the far end of the hall, slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. My pulse quickened. It might be a way out, or maybe a room where I could find something useful. Anything was better than staying in the open, exposed to whatever might come next. Pushing the door open, I slipped inside, closing it softly behind me. The room was dimly lit, but not empty. A large corkboard covered one wall, pinned with yellowing papers, photographs, and hand-scrawled notes. I stepped closer, scanning the board, and what I saw sent a shiver down my spine. Each paper held detailed records of a patient, their fears cataloged in neat, efficient handwriting. Photographs accompanied each entry, patients with vacant eyes and haunted expressions. Notes in the margins documented their progress, or rather, their deterioration over time. Increased fear sensitivity, heightened susceptibility, scheduled for extraction. My own photograph was there, staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes from a moment I didn't remember. Below my picture, in red ink, were the same words I'd seen before. Primary candidate for fear extraction calibration. A surge of rage and fear shot through me. This whole place was nothing more than a twisted lab, where they fed on our darkest fears, turning us into shells, hollow and compliant. The pills, the questions, the sessions, it was all part of some grotesque experiment. I grabbed the file with my name on it, folding it and shoving it into my pocket. I didn't know how much time I had before they found me, but I couldn't leave this evidence behind. If I made it out of here, the world needed to know what was happening in this place. I was about to turn and leave when my eyes fell on something strange, half hidden under a stack of papers on the desk. A small, black device like a remote control with a single red button on it. Scribbled next to it was a note, "Fail-safe for emergency shutdown." Felt almost too good to be true, but I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the device, tucking it carefully into my pocket beside my file. If it really could shut down the machines, it might be my only chance to end whatever horror they were conducting here. Just as I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint hum from down the hall, growing louder, like an engine coming to life. My stomach twisted as I realized what it was. The machines, rebooting after the override I triggered earlier. The hospital was coming back to life, and I was still trapped inside it. I slipped out of the room, heart pounding, and bolted back down the hallway toward the stairwell. I had to move quickly to reach the basement before they restored full control. My only chance now was to get to the machines and destroy them once and for all, with this device as my final lifeline. The hallway twisted and turned as I retraced my steps, but just as I reached the stairwell, the lights flickered, then dimmed, and in the shadows at the far end of the hall, I saw them, two figures, each marked by the same eerie red light pulsing from their temples. They'd sent the hollow patients to find me. Gritting my teeth, I clenched the wrench in my hand and darted down the stairs, hoping, praying, that whatever strength I had left would be enough to make it. I took the stairs in desperate bounds, the echo of my own footsteps swallowed by the deeper, heavier sound of the hollow patients following. That red light at their temples haunted me, flickering through my mind like a cursed heartbeat as I hurtled toward the basement. With each floor I passed, the hum of the machines grew louder, more insistent, as if they could sense me coming and were readying themselves for me. Finally, I reached the basement door. It was cold, a chill radiating from the metal that seeped into my skin. The hum beyond was overpowering now, a low, throbbing vibration that made my bones ache. I took a deep breath, clutching the black device in my hand, the small red button calling to me like a promise. Fail-safe for emergency shutdown. The words pulsed in my mind. This was my chance. The door creaked open, revealing a vast, dimly lit room lined with machinery. Tall metal towers loomed like silent sentries, their surfaces blinking with eerie lights that cast shifting shadows across the floor. Wires snaked across the room, leading to a central device, a massive, sinister machine that pulsed with a dull, red glow. And then I saw them. Rows of chairs facing the machine, each one outfitted with thick leather straps, and each with a small metal implant attached to the headrest, waiting to latch onto whoever sat there. I could almost see the patients, slumped and lifeless, trapped in endless nightmares fed by this hellish device. The hollow patient's footsteps echoed closer, their slow, mechanical shuffle growing louder. I had no time. I stepped forward, forcing myself toward the machine. The hum grew louder with each step, the air thick with a static charge that made my hair stand on end. My heart pounded, but I held on to the device, my thumb hovering over the red button. Max, the voice was quiet, almost gentle, and yet it froze me in place. I turned slowly to see the doctor, standing in the doorway, his face calm and composed, his eyes glinting with a cold, clinical interest. "I knew you'd come down here," he said, his voice low. "Curiosity always leads people like you to the truth." I tightened my grip on the device, my thumb pressing down harder, but I didn't press it. "Not yet. This place, what is it?" I demanded, my voice trembling with rage and fear. "What are you doing to us?" He smiled faintly, tilting his head. "What am I doing?" he repeated, as though the question itself amused him. "I'm simply pushing the boundaries of human fear, Max. We're studying its power, its capacity to reshape the mind, to hollow out the soul and create something pure." I felt a wave of nausea, the words sinking in with horrifying clarity. Hollow out the soul. They weren't just recording our nightmares. They were stripping us of everything, reducing us to shells, pawns in their twisted pursuit of power. He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming. "You should be proud. Your fears have been among the most potent we've ever recorded. You're an invaluable asset to our research." I shook my head, gripping the wrench in one hand and the device in the other. "I'm not your asset," I spat, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. "I'm ending this." He stopped, his smile fading as he noticed the device in my hand. For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his face. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice strained, almost pleading. "This device, it's not meant to be used like that. You'll destroy everything, including yourself." "That's a risk I'm willing to take," I whispered, feeling a surge of resolve as my thumb pressed firmly down on the button. The effect was instant. The lights flickered, then blazed bright, illuminating the room in a blinding white glow. The hum of the machines grew frantic, a high-pitched whine that made my ears ache. And then, one by one, the lights on each device began to fade, stuttering out like dying stars. The doctor's face twisted in horror, his hand reaching out as if he could somehow stop it. But it was too late. The machines shuddered, sparks flying from the wires, filling the room with the acrid smell of burning circuits. And then, with a final, echoing whine, the central machine collapsed into silence. I staggered back, the silence thick and deafening, punctuated only by the slow, shuffling steps of the hollow patients as they slumped to the ground, their red lights extinguished. The doctor was on his knees, staring at the darkened machine with a look of utter despair. He whispered something, words I couldn't hear, his voice choked and broken. I turned, leaving him there in the wreckage, the echo of his shattered words lingering in the silence as I made my way back to the stairs, back to the faint glimmer of freedom that awaited me. The stairwell felt longer than I remembered, each step heavier than the last. My legs trembled, my lungs tight with exhaustion and adrenaline. Every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive quiet, the scrape of my shoes on the concrete, the faint rattle of pipes above, the lingering hum that buzzed faintly in my skull even though the machines were dead. But it was over, I reminded myself. I shut them down. I'd escaped the clutches of that nightmare device, and I'd left the doctor behind, defeated and broken among the ruins of his twisted machine. But with every step, a gnawing dread crept back in, a whisper in my mind that told me something wasn't right. As I reached the top floor, I opened the door cautiously, glancing into the dimly lit hallway. It was eerily quiet, with only the flickering fluorescence casting long shadows across the sterile walls. There was no movement, no sign of the guards, no shuffling hollow patients lurking in the corners. Just emptiness. I moved forward slowly, my senses prickling with unease. Had they abandoned the building? Had the shutdown triggered some kind of evacuation? My footsteps echoed down the deserted corridor, the silence so thick it felt like a weight pressing down on me. And then, as I rounded the corner near my room, I froze. The walls, they were different. I could see faint outlines of writing, hundreds of sentences, scrawled in jagged, uneven letters, covering the walls from floor to ceiling. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding as I read the messages. They were warnings, fragments of terror and despair, left by patients like me. They feed on your fear. Don't let them see you afraid. It never ends. Even if you escape, they follow you. They're inside your mind. The walls can't hold them. The words seemed to swim before my eyes, twisting and reshaping as though they were alive, their meanings shifting and pulsing with each step I took. I felt dizzy, a sick realization sinking in. Shutting down the machines might not have destroyed them. It might have just unleashed something worse. I stumbled back, my head spinning. The walls seemed to pulse, the letters writhing as though they were trying to escape, to crawl off the walls and into my mind. My heart raced, and I gripped the wrench, my only comfort in the dark uncertainty that surrounded me. Suddenly, a low, metallic whisper filled the hallway, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You thought you could end us?" I backed away, the walls seeming to close in as the whisper continued, cold and mocking. "Fear is not in the machines. Max fear lives inside you. It always has." My breath hitched, the weight of those words pressing down on me, crushing. The machines hadn't created my nightmares. They'd simply amplified them, tapped into the fear already lurking in my mind. And by shutting them down, I'd set that fear loose, uncontained, unchecked, free to spread like poison through the cracks of this place. I stumbled back, hands pressed to my ears as the whisper grew louder, each word laced with a sickening familiarity. "You can't escape what's inside you. You brought us with you." The hall twisted, the walls blurring and shifting, the words on them pulsing in tandem with my heartbeat. I could barely think, barely breathe, as the realization crashed over me. This wasn't just a building with machines designed to amplify fear. It was a prison, a labyrinth crafted to trap us within the confines of our own minds. And in destroying the machines, I hadn't freed myself. I'd simply torn down the walls between my nightmares and reality. Staggering, I turned, forcing myself to keep moving, to find the exit. Even as the whispers echoed relentlessly, burrowing deeper, infecting every thought. I stumbled through the halls, each step feeling like a struggle against an invisible force that grew stronger with every passing second. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, their scrawled messages twisting and writhing, as if alive with a sick, pulsating energy. I pressed on, my only thought to escape, to break free of this place before it consumed me entirely. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They followed me, seeping into my mind, a chorus of taunts and shadows that grew louder with each step. You think you can outrun us, Max? We're part of you. You can't run from what's inside. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices only grew louder, echoing in the very marrow of my bones. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, the lines between memory, nightmare, and the present blurring until I couldn't tell if I was running from a real threat or merely from my own haunted mind. Finally, I reached the end of the corridor, the exit door looming ahead, shrouded in darkness. I staggered toward it, desperation surging within me. My hand closed around the handle, cold and solid under my trembling fingers. This was it. Freedom was just beyond this door. But as I pushed it open, I froze. Beyond the door was another hallway, identical to the one I had just left. The same peeling wallpaper, the same flickering lights, the same scrawled words clawing up the walls. I stumbled back, a strangled cry escaping my lips as I realized that I was right back where I'd started. I was trapped, running in circles in an endless, shifting maze. The whispers coiled tighter around me, mocking and triumphant. You're not escaping, Max. You're home. I turned, feeling a cold dread grip my heart. The walls seemed closer now, pressing in from all sides, their words shifting and merging until they formed a single phrase, repeated over and over. Welcome home, Max. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, feeling the weight of my fear crush down on me. The wrench fell from my hand, clattering uselessly to the ground. I could barely think, barely breathe, as the realization settled over me like a thick, suffocating fog. I was never meant to escape. They'd planned this all along, each message, each warning leading me deeper into the trap they'd set within my own mind. The machines had been a tool, yes, but the real prison was my fear, twisted and amplified until there was no escape, no way out. I closed my eyes, my body shaking with a despair so deep it felt endless. I was trapped here, in this nightmare, bound to these walls, the whispers my only companions. And then, as I sat there in the silence, one final message scratched itself across the wall in front of me, bold and stark, as if written by my own hand. There is no escape from what lives inside. My mouth went dry, and in that moment I understood. The machines had only shown me what was already there, lurking in the dark corners of my mind. I hadn't freed myself from my fears. I'd unleashed them, and now they were all that remained. I sat there, swallowed by the darkness, the walls closing in around me like the jaws of some ancient beast. The whispers grew softer now, almost soothing in their malevolent familiarity, like old friends, dark companions who had waited patiently to reveal themselves. The messages on the walls faded, their jagged letters sinking into the paint until they were nothing more than faint scars, ghosts of warnings that no longer mattered. I don't know how long I stayed there, lost in the silence, my mind drifting in and out of consciousness. Time had no meaning here. Minutes stretched into hours or maybe seconds. I was in a place beyond time, beyond reason. A purgatory crafted from my own worst nightmares, a prison built from my fears. But then, in the quiet, a thought stirred, a flicker of resistance that hadn't yet been crushed by the relentless weight of this place. If I could survive my own fear, then maybe I could still find a way out. I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and took a step forward, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The walls loomed on either side, but I focused straight ahead, forcing myself to push forward, one step at a time, through the endless corridor. The whispers returned, murmuring in the back of my mind, but I let them flow through me, letting their taunts and threats drift past like smoke. The words on the walls reappeared, faint and taunting. Yet I refused to look, refusing to acknowledge their hold over me. You are not real, I told myself over and over, clinging to that thin thread of defiance. You are only shadows. As I walked, the walls around me began to shift, subtly at first, but then with a dreamlike fluidity. The doors faded, replaced by bare concrete walls, and the corridor widened, leading to a room filled with empty beds, each one neatly made, the sheets white and sterile. This was the ward I had woken up in countless times, the place where the nightmares had first taken root. And in the center of the room stood the doctor. He looked at me with calm, knowing eyes, his hands clasped in front of him as if he'd been waiting. "You're back," he said, his voice as cold and measured as ever. "I knew you wouldn't get far. You can't escape what you are, Max." I clenched my fists, feeling a flicker of rage cut through the fog of fear. "This place," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor of terror beneath it. "It's not real. None of it is. You're just an echo of my own mind." He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you think?" he asked softly. "Then why are you still here?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, doubt surged within me. I was still here, still trapped, still haunted by the whispers and shadows. But I pushed the doubt aside, clinging to the fragile hope that had kept me moving. I am stronger than my fear. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, meeting his gaze with a defiance I hadn't felt since I'd first come here. "Because I am choosing to leave." For a brief second, his calm facade broke, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. A hint of fear, perhaps, or anger. But then he faded, his image dissolving like smoke, leaving nothing but the empty room. And as he disappeared, the walls around me began to shift again, brightening, opening up, until I was standing in the hospital hallway, bathed in the soft light of dawn filtering through the windows. The oppressive silence had lifted, replaced by the faint hum of life beyond the walls. I took a shaky breath, feeling the weight lift from my chest. The nightmare was over, but as I turned to leave, one last whisper drifted from the shadows, lingering in the back of my mind. "We'll be waiting, Max. Fear never really leaves." And as I walked out into the daylight, I couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere in the depths of my mind, the nightmare was only waiting for its chance to begin again.